So a month or two back, I made a video reading the first lines of every book on my TBR bookshelf, and in doing that, I was reminded of a reading project I'd had in mind for a while, which was to read a classic of English literature, along with its post-colonial prequel by another author that explored the story from a different perspective. And the books in question are, of course, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte and Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. I've had Jane Eyre on my TBR for as long as I can remember, and I've had this specific gorgeous edition sitting on my shelves mocking me for ages, but I knew I wanted to wait to read this until I had Wide Sargasso Sea on hand so I could read them back to back and really enjoy that experience. So now that I have both and also have been reminded that I wanted to do this, I'm really excited to film this reading vlog and share my thoughts with you, share the experience with you. I would highly encourage you to read these along with me, or maybe reread them if you've read them before, or maybe you've only read Jane Eyre but haven't read Wide Sargasso Sea. This would be a perfect opportunity. And I'm really excited to have some hopefully nuanced conversations with y'all in the comments, because I love the idea of reading this original classic work and then reading the post-colonial prequel that is looking more critically at the racial and gender dynamics from the perspective of someone who is both British and Dominican. So I'm really excited for this video. I'm going to read Jane Eyre first, and then once I finish, I'm going to read Wide Sargasso Sea. And of course, as always, I'll be doing mid-book updates and final updates at the end of the books, and I'll be talking both without spoilers and with clearly marked spoilers so that I can really get into the nitty-gritty of the themes and the plot and the characters, and hopefully y'all are as excited for this video as I am. I also wanted to take a minute to thank this video's sponsor, Bluehost, an all-in-one website builder and hosting platform, and uses powerful AI design tools to help you build a beautiful website in minutes. I feel like in this day and age, we all need a website. We all want to be able to put our thoughts out there and have a presence online, and services like Bluehost are so useful in that they allow you to make beautiful websites without having to take the time to learn how to code. You can ask their AI tools for what you need and watch them be built before your eyes like magic. Bluehost also has complete digital marketing tools and e-commerce functionality. Thank you to Bluehost for sponsoring this video. Click the link in my description box to try Bluehost today. So that is the plan for this video. I'm super excited. Like I said, I'm going to start with Jane Eyre first. So I'm gonna go start this, and when I get to the halfway point, I will come back and let you know my initial thoughts. Okay, so I am now halfway through Jane Eyre. I got to the halfway point last night before I went to sleep, and I have some thoughts to share. So let's chat about the first half of Jane Eyre. I'm going to start with non-spoiler-y things, and then I will warn you before I get into spoilers. So this, I'm enjoying it. First of all, I feel like I should say that up front. I am enjoying it, but it's not exactly what I expected. I think because I just recently read Pride and Prejudice, and often I feel like Austen and the Bronte sisters are pooled together as similar writers, that I was expecting something Pride and Prejudice-esque, and this definitely doesn't feel anything like Pride and Prejudice to me, which is fine. I'm liking it for what it is, but if I were to compare it to anything, I feel like the first portion of the book when Jane is a child reminded me a lot of Anne of Green Gables. A little more dark and a little less whimsical, but character-wise, I feel like Jane is very similar to Anne, both in her life situation, but also in just her personality. She's very stubborn and passionate and has a very strong sense of justice and fairness. Both of them are feisty and intelligent and easily get into sort of a righteous anger place. They both are sort of the odd ones out in their families or in their living situations. So I was getting a lot of Anne of Green Gables vibes at the start of this, which I personally loved because I love Anne of Green Gables. The whole series, but specifically the first book, I reread about 100 million times as a kid, and I actually have plans to possibly reread the whole series on my channel soon, so watch out for that. But I love Anne, and I love Anne of Green Gables, so I really enjoyed those similarities, even though I would say that Jane Eyre is definitely darker in tone and is just a little bit more blunt with the reality of the situation and how children were mistreated at the time, especially children who were poorer, had fewer resources or just had fewer family connections to protect them. I have always really resonated with Anne as a character. I always really related to her as a kid because I too often felt like the odd one out. I was always very emotional and sentimental and passionate and creative and kind of odd. Didn't always feel like I quite fit in with my peers. I often spent time alone, kind of making up my own imaginary worlds and entertaining myself in that way. And I also had quite a temper as a kid, and I would say that's something that's mellowed out a lot as an adult. I just had a serious temper as a child, and a lot of things made me mad. I feel like I could relate to Anne on that front, and then also Jane, because I feel like they both have that very passionate, very emotional personality type, and they're also both not always treated super fairly, and they really have that strong internal sense of justice and what's right and what's fair, and they get really mad when things are not just. And I also have that very strong internal sense of justice and fairness, and that was something I really struggled with as a kid and something that often got me very riled up and very mad. Again, very much relate to Anne in that way and Jane, and I feel like they are very similar in that way. What I find interesting is that in both cases, when they grow up, their personalities mellow out quite a bit, which in my own personal experience has been true, but I will insert the caveat that it's been a while since I reread the Anne of Green Gables series and the later books when she's older, so I really can't remember how much of that passionate, feisty, stubborn personality she holds on to as an adult. But it's interesting so far in Jane Eyre, it really feels like as soon as we fast forward from her as a child to her as an 18-year-old, she is almost a completely different person. She's much more mellow and calm and sort of unperturbed by mistreatment in a way that feels a little jarring to me. I feel like, again, maybe just because I relate so much to young Jane, I expect to see more of myself in older Jane. And I don't really. I feel like when I was the age that she is by halfway through the book, which is I think is 18 or 19, I was still very emotional and passionate and stubborn and had a hot temper and very much still feeling that righteous sense of justice and fairness. And I don't see that so much in her, which is interesting. And because we didn't really see that transition happen over time, we just jumped from her being 9, 10-ish to being 18, 19. And that shift has happened in that time that we weren't around. It feels a little jarring and a little bit like she's a different character. So I'm struggling with that a little bit. I am interested to see if my opinion on that changes as the book continues. Again, I'm only halfway through, so I'm sure we'll get even more character development. And I have been spoiled by living in a society to sort of the grand reveal of this book. Unfortunately, I do know the big twist, although I don't know how we get there and I don't know all the details because I've never watched any adaptations of Jane Eyre and I haven't read it before. So I don't have all the intricate pieces that build up to that reveal, but I do know the reveal. I'm not going to spoil you in case you have somehow managed to avoid that spoiler for this centuries-old book. I am interested to see how Jane will react when she learns about the twist, and if that will bring out some of that personality that I feel is lacking. We shall see. I kind of hope we do, because I would love to still see her be a bit more fiery and a little more passionate. I feel like the biggest hint we get into her former personality is in some of her conversations with Mr. Rochester, where they kind of have a little bit of that witty banter back and forth and a little bit of a biting, cutting, very honest, very blunt, not always super nice way of relating to each other. And that reminds me a little bit of Elizabeth and Darcy and their witty banter. And I talked about that in my review of Pride and Prejudice, which I will link for you in the description box if you missed it. It's a reading vlog. I really like that. And I could also relate to that because I feel like sharing that sort of similar personality type, I also enjoy a good debate and a good witty back and forth, just a little bit of animosity but well-meaning animosity, you know? So I feel like they have that a little bit, but Jane is definitely she's a lot more reserved and a lot more sort of meek than I would have expected. And even still in a lot of her interactions with Mr. Rochester, she very much feels sort of flustered by him and feels a little bit more submissive in a way that, again, for me, I can't relate to the way that she is acting around him, you know? So anyway, like I mentioned, this definitely has more of a darker, slightly more eerie, menacing tone to it. It's definitely more similar to something like Wuthering Heights than a Pride and Prejudice. But I would say even more so than Wuthering Heights, this book is reminding me of Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier a lot. There's a lot of similar vibes going on with sort of the spooky manor that has kind of its own presence in the story. You have a very mysterious man of the house who is a little more reserved and a little more closed off and mysterious. That's the best word for it. And then we have a protagonist who is a little bit more young and naive, who is in love with the mysterious older man of the house and can sense that there's something slightly off, something slightly wrong in the house, and is trying to kind of work her way around it. We even have the similarity of at least one servant in the house who is giving off creepy, menacing, possibly even dangerous vibes. So anyway, I feel like there's a lot of similarities here, which I love, again, because I love Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. It's one of my favorite classics, and I love those vibes. I love the eerie spookiness, the unsettling nature of everything, that mystery, that uncertainty is really fun. I'm enjoying the melding of some of my favorite classics in this, and I'm excited to see how it progresses through the second half. Really, the main thing that I'm struggling with is with Jane as an adult character and just feeling like she's lost a lot of her uniqueness and her personality and her verve. And I also really don't like Mr. Rochester. Let me know if this is a hot take. I have no idea. I'm trying to stay away from anything about Jane Eyre online because, like I said, I was already spoiled for the twist and I didn't want to get any more spoilers because I was trying to experience this properly for the first time. So I have not looked at any reviews. I didn't even reread the blurb before I started it. So I really don't know if Mr. Rochester is sort of a Heathcliff situation where I personally hate the character. I mean, not hate the character, but hate the person. I would not get along with a person if they were a real person. I find the character interesting and enjoy reading about them because they're an interesting character, but I don't like them as a person. Whereas much of the internet seems to romanticize and love the character and think that they're so romantic and sexy and appealing. I was very shocked by everything I'd seen about Heathcliff online once I finally read Wuthering Heights, because that man is an asshole in every possible way and is not romantic, and I just don't understand. Again, interesting character to read about, would never want to meet him in real life for any reason. Ever. And I'm kind of feeling that way about Mr. Rochester. He's giving me really bad vibes, red flags all around. He is a huge asshole and just admittedly, openly an asshole constantly so far. And he's an asshole to Jane a lot. Yeah, I'm not getting it. And I feel like, you know, someone like Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice, he also can be an asshole, but he at least has some redeeming qualities. And I feel like you get to see a little bit more behind the curtain of why he is the way he is. And you get to have a little bit more jovial, lighthearted moments, or you get to see him with his friends, Mr. Bingley, and them having a genuine friendship. You get to see him with his sister and how much he loves her and adores her and how kind he is to her. So you kind of get those inklings that he is not just a one-dimensional asshole. He has more to him. He is more complex than that. He has goodness to him and kindness to him. And I feel like I'm not getting that for Mr. Rochester so far, and I feel like part of that is that he is very mysterious and his backstory is mysterious and he's hiding things from Jane at this point in the story. And maybe once Jane is aware of the situation, he'll be able to open up more and we'll get a little bit more of that depth and there'll be something there that I can sort of hold on to. But right now, he's just kind of an asshole and I really hope they don't end up together. I think Jane is sweet and she doesn't deserve a man 20 years her senior who is just a jerk all the time as her life partner, you know? Those are my thoughts for the first half. I will also say the writing is gorgeous. Beautiful prose. I have a specific tab color just to mark passages that I feel are written beautifully. And there are some fun little direct to the reader fourth wall breaking passages that I quite enjoy as well, that really draw you in, and it feels like a conspiratorial relationship or a friend telling you a story, which I enjoy. So I'm having fun with it so far. There's definitely some commentary here on classism and also gender roles of women and girls in the family, in society at large. What do they bring to the table? What is their value? What it is like for women and girls who don't easily fit within the expected gender roles of the time. And then we also have some pretty scathing commentary on the hypocrisy of the good Christian, which I'm enjoying. And it's funny because I read the little preface before I started the introduction written by the author, and she's fighting back because I guess at the time when this is released, people were pretty upset about the representation of religion and religious people in the story who are pretty hypocritical and not very good, despite being very attached to the label of being a good Christian or being philanthropic or whatever. So it's funny that it looks like at the time it got a lot of feathers ruffled, and she was very adamant in her introduction to following editions that she does not give a shit if people are mad about it, and this is the story she's telling. And that religion is one thing, but people who use religion as an excuse to be terrible people are terrible people, and it shouldn't be controversial. So I kind of love that, and I am enjoying that commentary as well that's been sort of threaded throughout. I do enjoy Bessie and Jane's relationship. I enjoyed the bits with Helen at the school and Miss Temple. I enjoyed those relationships, and I was kind of sad that they seemed to mostly be over after the first part, and now that she is living in Mr. Rochester's house, she has friendships and she has connections with other characters, but so much of her storyline now is sort of orbiting Mr. Rochester, which I guess is relatable for your first love when you're 18 or 19, especially if you fall in love with an older person, for them to kind of become your whole world, to have such a big crush on them, and it's so overwhelming. It's like first love plus limerence all wrapped into one. And so I guess it makes sense, but I would love to get a little bit more of her relating to the other characters around her on a deeper level, or at least to see their interactions a little bit more. Maybe that'll happen in the second half. Yeah, I'm also curious to see how this, like, what is going on with Mr. Rochester constantly baiting Jane about him marrying Blanche and being okay with Blanche constantly insulting Jane to her face, or at least when Jane is in the room, as if she isn't there. That's really adding to my sense that Mr. Rochester is just kind of an asshole, because it seems obvious that he likes Jane on some level and maybe has feelings for her, but he is constantly throwing his connection with Blanche in her face and just being really, really rude about it, and then letting Blanche be so incredibly awful to her, and not stopping it or standing up for her in any way, which I'm finding pretty hard to stomach. Maybe there's a reason for that, but it's not very nice behavior. So anyways, I don't like him. I don't like him at all. But I will share some spoiler thoughts. So I'm going to get into spoilers now for the first half of Jane Eyre. And I'm just going to make clear that this is spoilers for the whole book. While I haven't finished it yet, I am going to mention the end twist spoiler. Well, I actually don't know if it comes out at the end. I have no idea when it happens, but it happens in the second half at some point that we learn this information, and I'm going to mention it. So even if you've read the first half of Jane Eyre, I would not recommend watching this spoiler section if you don't want to be spoiled for the big twist. You've been warned. Okay, so spoilers for Jane Eyre. I'm honestly feeling really sad that I was spoiled on the fact that Mr. Rochester is already married and his wife is being kept in the attic and has gone mad, or is being treated like she's gone mad. I wish I could experience this not knowing that. I feel like when it's revealed, it's going to be this huge revelation for Jane, and it's going to be explosive and exciting, and I'm sad that I'm not going to feel that excitement and shock because I already know. But I am still enjoying that sort of mysterious, slow build, and Jane having a feeling that something is wrong and feeling sort of unsettled and slowly seeing more things that are weird or off, but not suspecting the reality of the situation, because why would you ever suspect? that his wife is being hidden away in the attic. That would be really weird. So I'm excited for that reveal. I kind of hope it happens sooner rather than later because I just feel like there is so much potential for fallout. But we will see. I know that this book does not cover as much of the first wife's perspective, and that's kind of what Wide Sargasso Sea is all about and why I'm reading them as companion novels. So I'm actually not sure how much wife number one is in this book, but I do kind of hope that the reveal happens sooner rather than later because I feel like I'm reading with that at the back of my mind and with bated breath waiting for the reveal to happen. So it'll be nice once it actually does happen. Plus, I just want to know how that impacts everything and how that impacts Jane and how it impacts their relationship. I am really hoping that Jane gets really mad and we see some of that childhood passion and righteous anger. I really hope that she is as angry at Mr. Rochester as I feel like I'm going to be once we finally learn the reality of the situation, but we shall see. And I really hope that they don't end up together and Jane goes off and just does something without him because he does not deserve her, in my opinion. Again, maybe we'll learn stuff about him that will change my mind. But right now, he's not husband material. Plus, he's already married. Also, as I said with Pride and Prejudice and Wuthering Heights, the other two I have in this edition from LitJoy Crate, the illustrations are so gorgeous. I absolutely love them. They're so beautiful. Just look at that. It's so intricate and amazing. And I love coming across illustrations as I'm reading, like this one. When Jane's at school, her facial expression, she looks so downtrodden and upset. And I just want to hug her. I love these illustrations. So anyway, I think that's all I have for spoilers. I'm just really anticipating that reveal to come. I want to get to the point where I have no idea what's going to happen next and get to just ride the wave of the narrative instead of constantly wondering if this is the moment that Jane finds out. So I do wish I could have read this before knowing that fact, but alas. So that's it for spoilers, and those are all my thoughts for the first half of Jane Eyre. I'm really excited to finish this book. I'm really enjoying it even more than I expected to initially, and I feel like the second half is going to be dramatic and exciting. So hopefully it's similar to Rebecca in more ways than one, because I love the climax of Rebecca and the denouement. So fingers crossed. Okay, I'm going to go finish this and then I will be back to give you my final thoughts, and then I'll be able to read Wide Sargasso Sea, which I'm also very intrigued by. Well, friends, I have finished Jane Eyre. It took me longer to read the second half than the first half, and I must admit, it was a bit of a struggle. So let's get into it. Obviously, no spoilers to start with. I will warn you before I get into spoilers, but dang, yeah, this did not go the way I expected it to in the second half. And it's funny because even the first half didn't do what I expected it to, just from my sort of general cultural awareness of this story. The beginning of Jane as a child, and then the way she grew as an adult, and the way her personality shifted, and the way her relationship with Rochester was developing. None of that really went according to my expectations, but I feel like once I reached that middle point, we were getting more of those eerie gothic vibes, and there was more sort of tension. There was a little bit of a menacing quality to it, and I was really excited for the big reveal and for how that was going to fall out and all the things that were going to happen. And I assumed it was going to be sort of more dramatic, I guess, because like I said in my first update, the portion where she's a child felt very Anne of Green Green Gables-esque, but darker. And then once she was an adult, it really felt like I was reading something similar to Rebecca. And if you've read Rebecca, you know things get pretty wild in that book near the end. Things escalate quickly, okay? And so I was kind of expecting a similar vibe here. I thought that we would keep ramping up on the tension and the gothic vibes and the mystery and the danger, and we would have this really dramatic situation. Though I was sort of wondering how that was going to happen because there was so much of the book left, and it felt like it would be kind of hard to maintain the pace and the tension of sort of escalating in that way. And the way it did come together, honestly, I am sorry to all of the big fans of this book out there. The second half was boring, y'all. It was pretty boring. We ramped up and things were so intense, and we finally got the reveal, and I was so excited to see the fallout, and then we barely got any fallout at all, and ended up in a different place with a different set of characters, and Jane sort of withdrawing into herself and slowly building up her relationships with new people and sort of a slice of life day to day, and even Jane is bored at this point. And it just felt so sudden, so abrupt, and I was feeling untethered in the story at that point. I wanted to have more of a confrontation. I wanted Jane to get answers. I wanted there to be some sort of a climax, and it just felt like we were robbed of that portion of the story, and I just didn't care as much about the characters in the second half or the themes that were being explored. The second half was much heavier in its religious themes, and while the first half did have religious themes, it was more so focused on sort of calling out the hypocrisy within religion, or the hypocrisy of people who use religion as a bit of a cloak or a shield to allow themselves to act in whatever way they deem beneficial to themselves, but then to frame it as being in service of God or religion. So I found that sort of critique interesting in the first half, but in the second half, there was much more religious content. It was just really leaning into the spiritual side of Jane as a character and some of the other characters she was around, and it was a much more frequent topic of conversation, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I just am not particularly interested in that personally. As an atheist, it's not the most interesting thing to me. It's like when I read books with basketball in them. There's nothing wrong with basketball, or books that talk about basketball or include it a lot. I just have zero interest in basketball. So I just zone out. And I felt like I was doing that in the second half of this book. The whole spiritual side of it was just not super interesting to me. And like I said, I just felt like the change of scenery, the change of location, the change of characters really cut the tension, and it felt like we were starting over, almost like it was a sequel, but without getting a real conclusion. We do eventually get a little bit more closure for that initial situation. We do sort of learn what happened to various characters, but it all happened off the page. Not only were we not witnesses to the most exciting, dramatic, climactic parts of that first plot line, but also Jane wasn't there. She just heard about it a year later. I guess I found that kind of disappointing, I'm not gonna lie. I did like that Jane felt like in the second half, slowly, very slowly, but eventually it feels like she was starting to regain her sassiness and her self-assuredness and her passion and stubbornness and willingness to stand up for herself and for her values and her wants and needs, and I really appreciated that. I'm glad that we got that inkling. I do think, I'll talk about this in the spoiler section, but there was definitely a glaring moment near the end that she did not do enough standing up for herself as I personally would have liked, but I do feel like she was making progress and she was sort of finding her way back to herself. So I'm just going to headcanon that she kept going in that direction and kept working on that and kept finding her way back to her feisty, passionate self. Because I would say for the vast majority of this book, that Jane is sort of missing in action, which again was frustrating for me to read. Probably realistic, again, and realistic for me in my experience as someone who was passionate and stubborn and feisty as a kid, to sort of go through a period where you retreat a little bit and you become more of a people pleaser, especially if you're someone like Jane who has been abandoned and neglected. She has a very deep need for love and connection, which makes total sense psychologically and, character development wise. And so it does make sense that she would lean into being more of a people pleaser and trying to do whatever she can to maintain her relationships and to please the people around her, to keep them around so she won't be abandoned Again, I get it. I can relate on a certain level, but still frustrating to read, for sure. Things I liked about the second half, because I did like things. I did still think it was very beautifully written. There were several passages that I just found very lyrical and musical and scrumptious to read. Yeah, generally I was less engaged in the second half, less interested in the themes and the direction the plot was going and the new characters that were introduced. Just less my personal cup of tea, but there's so much in the second half that I can't really talk about without spoilers, so I'm gonna leave it there, I think, for my non-spoilery thoughts, and I'm gonna get into spoilers for the second half of Jane Eyre. So you're being warned now, if you don't want to be spoiled, like I was, for at least one big thing before I read this book, click in the chapters in the description box to the end of the spoiler section. Okay, so spoilers. So basically, shortly after that halfway point, we finally get the reveal that Mr. Rochester is already married and his wife is still living, and Bertha is living on the third floor in the manor, and she is mentally ill to some capacity. They are calling her insane, and instead of institutionalizing her, he's decided to keep her in the manor locked up for the rest of her days, because apparently that's kinder. Not sure I agree with that, but okay. She's been locked up for a decade, so that's lovely. So as they're at the chapel attempting to get married, there is an objection. Someone has found out about this attempt at a new marriage and knew that he was already married and announced it at the church. So Jane finds out as they're trying to get married that he is already married and about the woman in the attic, and they go back home and Jane is distraught. And one of the things that bothered me the most about that scene, other than the fact that obviously it's going to be frustrating and upsetting for that to be revealed because it's terrible, and I feel bad for Jane that she fell in love with someone who would imprison his mentally ill wife in a windowless room for a decade and talk about her in such a disgustingly ableist and racist and just generally disgusting way. And then, of course, lie to Jane about it through his gritted teeth and gaslight her about it nonstop for the whole time that she lives with him. But he loves her, apparently. Of course he does. But also the fact that that whole scene, Jane has no agency. She has no ability to speak about her feelings, to react, to have any role in her own life. The whole scene from even before they get to the chapel is completely driven by Mr. Rochester. He's pulling her aggressively by the hand, rushing her, telling her they have to get married right this second, and just pushing it. And then once it's revealed, he's like, okay, fine, we'll go home. And, not even talking to her and seeing if she's okay. He's just, again, focused on his own feelings, his own struggles, his own suffering, that he can't allow Jane to have feelings and have a reaction. And eventually, when they do get back to the manor and do talk a little bit, again, it is so self-focused. It is so much of just a pity party for Mr. Rochester. And again, very little patience or empathy or space given to Jane to grieve and react and be angry. He doesn't let her have those feelings, and it really pissed me off to read. I think also after the halfway update, but before this, is when Bertha actually comes down and is in Jane's room, and she wakes up while she's in there, and she's looking through her closet and sees her wedding dress and her veil and ends up destroying her veil. And Jane talks to Mr. Rochester about it, and he 100% gaslights her into believing that she imagined it or dreamed it. Again, disgusting behavior. It's a lot. And then he tries to convince her that she should just ignore her principles and also the social rules of the day and put her reputation at risk to be his mistress so that he can still have her, even though they can't get married. And I was really happy that Jane stood up for herself and acknowledged that that was not the life for her and decided to leave. But I was annoyed that she did not think it through for more than a millisecond and didn't take any of her money or belongings with her, or plan at all and try to get a position somewhere else to work. She just left in the middle of the night with one bag and then was so distraught that she left her only bag behind in a carriage and ended up completely destitute, wandering the roads, starving in the rain. Which, again, maybe it's realistic when your whole life has been turned upside down, you've been being gaslit for months, and you just learned that the man you love is a monster and lied to you, and your whole life has been ruined, and you're distraught and heartbroken. Sure, but this girl has no self-preservation instinct. Then, of course, she finds herself on the doorstep of kind strangers who end up taking her in and helping her, and of course, coincidentally, they end up being her literal cousins. Isn't that perfect and amazing? And also, coincidentally, she is left a huge sum of money by her uncle, so she is now independently wealthy. All those coincidences just made me roll my eyes, to be honest. It's too perfect, you know? And it's in the second half when she's living with her cousins and working as the mistress and teacher for a school for poor children in the area that I just really lost interest in the book. I didn't find her cousins all that interesting. I didn't find reading about Jane being very bored in her life and constantly insulting poor people super interesting to read. She's left the money, she becomes wealthy, and she immediately doesn't want to work as a schoolmistress for poor kids anymore because that is beneath her, which is just lovely. But she makes a point to say that some of the kids did end up being intelligent despite being poor, so that's pretty cool for them, and that British poor people are the best poor people on the planet. So that's nice. But she doesn't want to teach them anymore now that she has money, because why would she? So she retreats to her cousin's home. Eventually, her cousin asks her to marry him and wants her to be his missionary wife, and she doesn't want to do that, which was another moment where I appreciated Jane because she stood up for herself and said, you know, I would go with you as your cousin, but not as your wife, and just consistently turns down his proposals. St. John, her cousin, is also an asshole and not very pleasant. He's very patronizing and very holier than thou. He thinks literally, but I'm speaking figuratively. Just generally unappealing, even though he's apparently attractive, but again, irrelevant. And then one night there's some sort of mystical, I guess it's supposed to be like a spiritual thing, like they were both praying to know what happened to the other one, so God helped them out or something. I don't know. But she hears someone calling for her and knows that it's Mr. Rochester and knows she has to find him, and she goes back to the manor to try to find him, and the manor has been burnt down, and she's horrified and thinks that everyone's been killed and learns the whole story. Turns out Mr. Rochester was there during the fire that was set by his wife, and he went up to try to save the servants and to save her. She ends up jumping to her death from the roof, and he eventually escapes the building, but in the process injures his hand enough that it has to be amputated, and he goes blind. So she finds him at the little cottage he's living at with just a handful of servants and sort of surprises him, and he ends up proposing again, and she says yes, and they're living together happily, married, and he eventually regains a little bit of sight, not enough to read or write, but enough to sort of get around on his own. And that's the end of the book. And I can't believe that we could have had a huge dramatic confrontation of some sort after the truth is revealed about Bertha, but we don't get that. They barely talk about it, and then she leaves. When she comes back, she doesn't bring it up. She doesn't ask about Bertha. She doesn't take him to task about imprisoning his wife for a decade. She doesn't take him to task for lying to her. Nothing. There's no consequences for Rochester. I mean, I suppose the consequences are supposed to be that he got injured in the fire, but she doesn't hold him accountable for his actions. I really wish we'd seen more of Bertha. We got a couple tiny scenes with her, but she was barely on the page. We learn almost nothing about her, and the little bit we do learn about her is from Mr. Rochester, and I'm sorry, I just don't trust him as a narrator of that story. So I am looking forward to reading Wide Sargasso Sea because it's supposed to be from Bertha's perspective. Obviously, it's not written by the original author, but I feel like it will flesh out her story more. But the second half was just, you know, the fact that they end up together, okay, we're supposed to, I guess, accept that Mr. Rochester has changed and he's learned his lesson. I still don't like him. I'm glad that he didn't just run out of the house when it was on fire and save himself and ignore anyone else in the house, but it still doesn't make up for all of his abusive and manipulative tactics and literally imprisoning someone for a decade in his home. So I'm still not a fan of Mr. Rochester. I did not want them to end up together. I guess I'm glad they're happy, and maybe he's a better person now, but I still can't be fully on board. Like I said in the non-spoilery section, I just wasn't as interested in the characters, in the setting, in the second half, or in the themes. It just didn't draw me in as much. It wasn't as exciting. There was no mystery anymore or tension. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I can say that's spoilery. I don't think so. I think I covered it all. So, spoilers over. Yeah, I definitely disappointed in the second half of this. Just less to my taste. for sure. I think the beginning is strong enough and the writing itself is strong enough and the character development, the character work for me to generally have a positive view of the entire book, even if I would have been happier if we had a couple dramatic scenes after the wedding scene and then called it a day and ended it there instead of including that second half. So I think because I have such mixed feelings and my feelings change so much between the first half of the book and the second half of the book, I think I'm sitting around a 3-star. I think so. I think 3 stars is the most I can give it, unfortunately. So those are my thoughts on Jane Eyre. I'm glad I read it. Definitely, but I'm a little disappointed. I'm not gonna lie. Feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments down below and let me know if you agree with me or if you disagree with me. As long as you're respectful about it, I feel free. I'm gonna stop waffling now because I feel like I've said everything that I can say about this book, but I am gonna start Wide Sargasso Sea, which I'm very excited about. I just realized that I don't have the book here with me. It's in my living room, but I'm excited to get a different perspective on the story, and I'm excited to learn more about a character that had very little page time despite their importance to the plot. So I'm gonna go start Wide Sargasso Sea, and I'll be back when I get to the halfway point. Hormones are high, more than just some butterflies. No, I wanna fall in love. Late at night I'm thinking about you. Oh, wanna try on my fuzzy pink handcuffs. Ooh, I hear you knocking, baby. Come on up. Hey, I'm back, and Yoda is here with me, and I'm halfway through Wide Sargasso Sea, and wow, this is so good. I expected it to be because I loved the first line. It was one of my favorite first lines in that first lines video that I filmed. Just absolutely so to the point and succinct and powerful and layered and punchy and so good. It was not false advertising for this book. I love the prose. It is so simple and straightforward and yet so hauntingly beautiful. It kind of reminds me a little bit of The Weak Spot in that very sort of sparse, simple prose that has a lot of space between all the lines with really heavy tension and subtext. You can just feel all of the tension and animosity and danger sort of bubbling under the surface in what's left unsaid. And I feel like this has a very similar quality to it. And I loved it in The Weak Spot, and I love it here too. And it's so funny because I really enjoyed the writing of Jane Eyre. Probably my favorite thing about the book was the prose. I found it beautiful. And it's so completely opposite to the prose here. Very, very different writing styles, but I love both of them for different reasons, of course. Yeah, wow, this is heartbreaking and just overall sort of achingly, melancholically beautiful, just sad, and you really feel the despair. Oh, Yoda doesn't like despair. Bye, sweetie. Because we know from the outset where this character's life is going, and I'm really trying not to spoil anything so that I'm not inadvertently spoiling you for Jane Eyre, but just keep in mind, even for the non-spoilery sections for this book's existence is kind of a spoiler for Jane Eyre. So if you look into this book, if you read a blurb for this book, you're going to be spoiled for part of Jane Eyre. And I'm really trying not to add to that, and I'm trying to speak really generally and vaguely about it. But if you're really concerned about spoilers and you want to read Jane Eyre, I would just pause the video and go read Jane Eyre and come back and watch this once you've read it, because I really don't want to spoil you. But because we know where this character's life is going to go and what's going to happen to her, it just makes it so much more painful to experience her childhood and see how much she suffered already and how lonely her childhood was, how much loss and grief she experienced. There's just a lot of melancholy, and there's a lot of hope still for, a better life maybe. And it's really, really heartbreaking to know that she's not going to get that better life, that she's not going to find the happiness and the freedom and the joy and the love and the peace that she so craves. And it's so heartbreaking, but it's gorgeous. Oh my goodness. Wow. Yeah, beautiful. I'm definitely feeling lots of feelings reading this. It's interesting. I finished part 1, and then I am sort of maybe a third of the way through part 2, or maybe a quarter of the way through part 2. And part 1 is from our female protagonist's point of view, and part 2 switches to a different perspective, another character who is in Jane Eyre. And it's really interesting to read this different interpretation of that character. I would say it's more, well, I don't know. I would say it's pretty accurate to how that character is represented in Jane Eyre, but I can tell reading it that the author has a different perspective on the character than Charlotte Bronte has on the character, and that's really interesting. And I feel like my personal perspective on the character aligns more with Jean Rhys, and so I'm enjoying sort of reading the character with that slight shift in tone, I suppose. The character is just a little bit more menacing and a little more cold and calculating, and again, that sort of aligns with how I had interpreted them and sort of read the text in Jane Eyre, and so I'm enjoying that. But yeah, it's a really sad read, especially knowing what happens in Jane Eyre. I'm trying to find, at the end of part 1, I wrote sort of a long annotation at the end. Not as long as some of the annotations I've written. I've definitely written longer ones, but I'm going to read it in the spoiler section because while I didn't write anything overtly spoilery, I'm just really trying to be extra cautious not to spoil anyone for Jane Eyre. I'm going to get into spoilers, but just know I'm loving this so far, and I'm flying through it, and I'm probably going to finish it tonight, even if it's really late, and come back sleepy at 2 a.m. or something to give you my final thoughts, because I don't think I'm going to be able to go to sleep until I finish it. So, spoilers for the first half. Oh my god. It's interesting, actually. I'm curious to know if we get an explanation at some point of why she's called Bertha in Jane Eyre and her name is Antoinette here. I guess we'll find out. Antoinette, or Bertha, is Mr. Rochester's first wife, the mad woman in the attic, his wife in the attic, who eventually sets his home on fire, and she is the reason why Jane and Mr. Rochester can't get married, his whole tragic backstory. I don't remember if I mentioned this in my final review of Jane Eyre in the spoiler section, but I kept sort of stewing about it for a couple hours after I filmed that update, because I just kept thinking about how Bertha reminded me of The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Charlotte Perkins Gilman. If you have not read that, this is probably going to spoil that for you, but it's 30 pages and it's so worth reading. So if you haven't read The Yellow Wallpaper, please go read it right now. Like literally pause this video, find it. It is easy to find, free on the internet. I'm pretty sure it's in the public domain at this point. Read the 30 pages. It will take you no time at all. And then come back so you know what I'm talking about. But The Yellow Wallpaper, you have a woman who's suffering from, I believe, postpartum depression, and she's locked away in this room with yellow wallpaper in this house in the country because, you know, the thought is, well, she's not doing too well, so we'll let her rest. We'll just lock her away in this room. She can rest as long as she needs, and she'll recover, and then she'll be back to normal, and we can all pretend that nothing happened and not give any other mental health support. And of course, being locked in a bedroom when you're already suffering from postpartum depression, you might eventually start to lose your mind a little bit. And she does. And it's just this really poignant, beautifully written, blunt and visceral and heartbreaking and heart-wrenching exploration of the generations of women who were institutionalized or at the very least confined because they dared to have emotions that society didn't want to deal with, because they dared to struggle with their mental health, because they dared to ever have postpartum depression, anxiety, or just feel a little bit of ennui or dissatisfaction with their role in life. Or maybe they were dealing with, you know, being passionate and opinionated or getting angry when they had a right to be, and they were just locked away and, you know, throw away the key. And I just kept thinking about those parallels and thinking about The Yellow Wallpaper, and then just thinking, you know, even if she was mad, as Mr. Rochester likes to say, before locking her away, in what world is being locked in a small bedroom for a decade going to improve someone's mental health? But also, you could be the most sane person on the planet, and that's not me. But I'm sure there's someone out there who is 100% totally sane. And that person, locked in a room without windows for a decade, would probably lose their mind. There's a reason why solitary confinement is considered cruel by a lot of people, because it is incredibly difficult on the human brain. I just kept getting more and more angry because the more I thought about it, the more I was convinced that there was nothing wrong with Bertha or Antoinette, but being locked in a room for a decade would turn anyone into the worst possible version of themselves. And most of us would lose our grip on reality. And it just makes me more and more angry and makes me hate Mr. Rochester more and more and more. I already did, but I just spent the last couple hours roiling in my own anger, and I kept thinking about coming down here and adding an addendum to that spoiler, and was just like, no, it's fine. You can say what you need to say later once you're halfway through Wide Sargasso Sea. So I held it in while I was reading this, but it definitely was growing, and reading this was just feeding that anger more and more and more. So anyway, when I finished part one, which is from Antoinette's point of view, this is what I wrote. It is so unbearably heartbreaking to read this bleak, lonely, traumatic childhood, knowing she never gets out, never finds happiness, never knows freedom, that she is bartered and sold, traded and won, then trapped in a gilded cage, left to rot and fester and go mad. To know that this is not a unique story of women institutionalized and confined and imprisoned for being sad or lonely or angry or unfulfilled or torn apart by grief. I feel so much righteous anger for her and wish Jane had felt it too, that they had banded together against the oppression of women rather than faced off like enemies, as if Rochester were ever any kind of prize to be won. A true tragedy. I loved that we got to start with Antoinette as a child like we did with Jane, and that mirroring effect is just so beautiful and so perfect to really drive home and reinforce the fact that Antoinette was not a special case. She was not a mad woman pretending to be sane to trick him into this sham of a marriage. She was a girl with a sad childhood who probably had some mental health struggle with things like depression and PTSD, and the way she was treated by Rochester and being brought halfway across the world and having her whole life changed, her foundations rocked, being separated from everything she'd ever known is what drove her to madness, not some sort of innate predisposition to insanity. And that Jane, having a similar sad childhood, having the same propensity or possibility of dealing with things like depression and PTSD, we already know she has attachment issues. If she were treated the same way Bertha or Antoinette was treated, she would likely have the same fate. I just think it's so brilliant and so wonderful and amazing. And I love Jean Rhys's brain, the fact that she decided to start the novel that way and to really mirror it in that way and just drive home even further that there's no fundamental difference between Antoinette and Jane. They are the same girl. And Mr. Rochester even notes, once we get into part 2 and it's from his perspective, that Antoinette is beautiful in a strange way, that she's a little disconcerting, that she has this sort of fieriness to her, that she has this bubbly, unique quality, and that he is attracted to her and feels this pull to her. Even though he claims he never properly or truly loved her, he is, kissing her and holding her when she's sad and comforting her and wanting to sleep with her regularly. All his actions say that he is attracted to her and interested in her and could have a potential to eventually love her. But it almost feels like he's trying to justify his later actions by framing it that he never loved her and she was always a stranger and there was always something a little odd, a little disconcerting, a little unsettling about her. Again, as a way to sort of ease his own guilt for what he did and what he turned her into, even though all of his actions feel very much like he's earnestly trying to connect with her and is drawn to her in that way. And again, it just makes me so sad and so scared for Jane that she is going to face a similar fate. And maybe Mr. Rochester is a changed man. I don't know. I personally think it would be very difficult to evolve and change from a person who would imprison their partner in an attic for a decade to someone who is actually a supportive, loving, healthy spouse. But, you tell me in the comments. Maybe that's a totally reasonable thing for someone to evolve out of when they're already in their 40s or however old he is in Jane Eyre. I already forgot. I'm just finding it so interesting. I'm finding the writing really beautiful. Again, similar to The Weak Spot, there's not a lot of overt horror or overt sort of menacing things happening. There certainly are a couple events, like when the townspeople surround their house and set it on fire. When Antoinette is a child, obviously that is overtly menacing. But there's a lot of moments where it's just a look here, or slightly out of place phrase uttered there, or a pause or a hesitation, or a description of the landscape that feels a little cold and distant or claustrophobic and oppressive. And all of those factors just really lend that eerie, unsettling, menacing undertone to everything. Again, especially knowing where this is going. You already kind of have that in your head, but the writing so perfectly underscores that and amplifies it. Ugh, it's gorgeous. I'm loving it. I'm loving it so much. Oh, it's beautiful. I'm such a fan of this. I'm so glad I'm reading this right now. And it's also making me feel better about Jane Eyre. Not making me like Jane Eyre more necessarily. I feel pretty set on my sort of 3-star mixed feelings about Jane Eyre as a piece of literature on its own, but this is definitely amplifying the whole experience of this literary universe, It's really adding to my personal reading experience. This also addresses racism in a much more compelling and direct way than Jane Eyre. There's racism in Jane Eyre, but it's really sort of brushed over, brushed aside, mostly ignored, whereas in this novel it is really front and center, and the dynamic between the different groups of people living in the West Indies is very much influenced by race, and that is something that is sort of at the forefront of a lot of their interactions and how their community has organized itself. And this is a turbulent time in the wake of the abolishment of slavery, and there's a lot of sort of shifting societal hierarchies, I suppose, and a lot of resentment and anger, understandably. And so that is so much more at the forefront here, which feels very apt considering the setting and considering this character and her experience in a way that was definitely missing in Jane Eyre. So I'm really appreciating that perspective as well. And yeah, I really love the writing here. I would love to read a single quote that would convey how beautiful I find the writing. the whole is more than the sum of its parts. It's really an overall effect that's being delivered more so than individual lines, but there are quite a few really great individual lines. Still I cling, and the seconds pass, and each one is 1,000 years. So it was all over, the advance and retreat, the doubts and hesitations, everything finished, for better or for worse. "Oh, England, England," she called back mockingly, and the sound went on and on like a warning I did not choose to hear. And if the razor grass cut my legs and arms, I would think, it's better than people. Black ants or red ones, tall nests swarming with white ants, rain that soaked me to the skin. Once I saw a snake. All better than people. Better, better, better than people. My father, visitors, horses, feeling safe in bed, all belonged to the past. Of course, the first line of the book, which I loved so much in my Reading First Lines video, they say when trouble comes, close ranks, and so the white people did. I could go on, but I won't, because I really want to finish this book. And the more I talk, the more I have to wait to read. So that's it for spoilers. Those are my thoughts on the first half of Wide Sargasso Sea. I'm loving it. I am going to go inhale it now, and I'll be back to tell you my final thoughts. I have a feeling this is going to be a 5-star read. You never know. The second half could really go off the rails, but I don't see that happening. I'm really, really, really enjoying this. So sad and haunting and beautiful. If you've read Jane Eyre, but you haven't read this, run, don't walk, okay? Just take my word for it. Okay, I'm gonna go finish this, and I'll be back when I'm done. So as I predicted, I could not go to sleep until I finished it. So it's 2 a.m. and here I am. I thought it would just be better for me to share my thoughts tonight before I go to sleep instead of waiting till tomorrow. I mean, obviously, the longer I wait after finishing a book, the more some thoughts can percolate, and sometimes my feelings and thoughts change, or things settle, or I have more time to kind of process it. But I also feel like there's something uniquely special and often very telling about my immediate reaction after I finish a book, about anyone's immediate reaction when they finish a book. So I like to try to film my updates very closely to when I finish a book, and I literally finished this maybe 5 minutes ago. Just took me some time to turn the camera on and grab my microphone. So this was fantastic. I feel like you could probably already tell from the first update and just my face and countenance, but I loved this. This is a 5-star read for me. This was fantastic. I just love taking a work of fiction like Jane Eyre, which to me was very mixed and had its, its highlights, had its merits, certainly, but also had its blind spots and its frustratingly sparse areas, and has one particular character who has so much potential and is so pivotal to the plot, who then just gets so woefully passed over and ignored and dehumanized. To take that character and make them the protagonist of their own story, to give them a backstory, to give them life, to give them their humanity and their identity, their own personality, thoughts, and feelings, is fantastic. And I just feel like it was so well done. It's so funny because I briefly perused a couple of reviews that were not tagged as spoilers after I filmed my midway update, just out of curiosity. And it seems like a lot of people really hate the writing style, which is it's just so interesting to me how different we are as readers and how much our tastes vary, because I loved the writing style. Again, very different from Jane Eyre, and I loved the writing style of Jane Eyre as well. But I just really like this sort of modern, sparse, layered writing style. I just find that there is something so poignant and beautiful and piercing and subtle about it. And I really do love, I think I talked about this a lot in my Weird Books reading vlog, which if you missed that video, go check it out. That was a fun one for me. I had a great time. But something I talked about there is that one of the things I love about sort of more experimental books, more modern books, books that play with form or expectations, books that are a little bit more vague or sparse or dreamlike or hazy, I feel like they ask the reader to step in and be more present and more of a active participant to create the story. And there was a little bit of that quality here too, which is so cool because this book is not modern by our, current standards. This was published in the 60s, I believe. Let me double check that. First published in 1966 from the introduction, which I have not read yet, just because I was worried it might have spoilers. So I just marked it so I could read it afterwards. It seems like it was written over a long period, or sort of conceived of and in production since as early as the 1930s. So this isn't really a modern book. It's certainly modern in comparison to Jane Eyre, but not obviously to our current perspective in the 2020s. And yet it feels so incredibly modern, and it feels very thoughtful and reflective and piercing and critical and intersectional in a way that I'm surprised to find in a book published in the 60s. I just think this was gorgeous. I think it filled in a lot of the gaps that I felt were missing in reading Jane Eyre. Not all of them. There are a couple gaps to do with Jane as a character, which this book does not address, that still are empty for me and that I would have loved to get more from the original book. But this really gave so much more richness and context for mostly the protagonist in this book, who I'm not naming still because I'm trying not to spoil anyone. I'm really trying. And the other character who was more heavily featured in Jane Eyre, but again is seen from a different perspective here. I just thought it was great. I thought it was so fantastic. And it's really interesting to me, the few reviews that I perused, the very mixed reactions to the writing style, but also the very mixed reactions to how the characters were portrayed. It does seem like there's a common theme that people who were a fan of Mr. Rochester when they read Jane Eyre were not a fan of how the various characters were portrayed here. And I really find that interesting because I do think, again, trying to keep this spoiler free for this moment, I think there's something to be said about developing your opinion of a character or a story or a situation and then feeling this urge. I feel like the human brain, to a certain extent, has this urge to maintain the structures of what we've already learned and understood, and not to sort of constantly question and shuffle things, because that's too much processing power. This is just, I don't know that this is true, this is my theory, but just this idea that we learn something or we make a decision about something, we make a judgment about something, and then we file that as settled in our brain. And yes, we can learn new information and change our opinion, but that takes effort. We have have to find that thing in our filing system in our brain and pull it out and peruse it and consider it and compare it to this new information and determine which we feel has more weight or which is more true and reassess it. And all of that takes a lot of processing power and effort and thought and consideration and thoughtfulness and willingness to accept that maybe we were wrong. And all of that is hard and takes effort. And so often it's easier not to do that and just not to question our beliefs and judgments and understandings and what we think we know. And it does feel like something about this book really pushes people's buttons if they didn't sort of already align with the ideas here and with this sort of interpretation of the characters as Jean Rhys saw them. And I just find that really fascinating. I find it really interesting. I, of course, was already aligned with Jean Rhys's view on these characters. I made it very clear that I was not a fan of Mr. Rochester reading Jane Eyre. And so seeing him portrayed in the way he's portrayed in this book was not making me question my views on him because it aligned pretty closely with how I had already interpreted the character. I could definitely see in the few reviews I was perusing people having their feelings about Mr. Rochester questioned by this tiny little book and not liking it, which is just really interesting to me. So I really liked the characters. I thought the characters were incredibly vivid and compelling, especially the main character, but also several of the other characters who Jean Rhys invented for this story. I just felt really jumped off the page, and they had really dynamic relationships and very strong personalities, really great character work. I thought it was fantastic. And the world building, the descriptions of the setting were really gorgeous. Again, I think I mentioned this in the first update, but just this really heavy, oppressive feeling from the descriptions that were really evocative of that heat of the islands. I used to work on a cruise ship, so I spent months at a time going between the Bahamas and the Cayman Islands, etc., etc. And especially as a Canadian, which I feel like is maybe slightly comparable to, how an English British person would feel. It feels so oppressive, the heat and the sun, and it's just constant, and it's nice for short spurts, but when you're in it all the time, it just is this feeling of, it almost feels unnatural because you're just not used to the climate, which makes sense. It just felt like the descriptions were so apt and really brought me back to the time that I spent, in the Caribbean. And like I said in the first update, there's just this constant sense of heartbreak because we know where the story is going, and there's this foreboding, there's a melancholy, there's a oppressive feeling. I feel like that's the best term, not only for the descriptions of the environment and the weather, but also of the narrative. It feels oppressive. You feel the pressures the main character is feeling and sort of the walls closing in, and the way that pressure is changing her, transforming her into something new. And it was just brilliantly done. I'm such a huge fan. I am struggling so hard to talk about this without spoilers, so I think that's going to be it for me. Non-spoilery thoughts. I'm going to speak with spoilers for a bit, and then I will wrap this video up. So, spoilers for Wide Sargasso Sea and also for Jane Eyre. Tread with caution. Spoilers for both books. I feel so terrible for Antoinette, and I am so pissed off to realize that the name, again, this is obviously not necessarily Charlotte Bronte's original intention because this was written by a different author, but just the headcanon that Bertha was a name that he just liked, and so he decided to call her that, even though that's not her name, and just continues to refer to her as Bertha. And when she calls it out and asks him to please not call her Bertha because that's not her name, and where did that even come from, and please call me Antoinette because that's my name, and he thinks it's totally reasonable to just say, oh, well, I like the name Bertha. And I like you. When I think about you, I think of you as Bertha. So why would I not call you that? And sees no problem with it. Like, just the dehumanization of her starts so early. And honestly, it blew my mind and pissed me off the way that he essentially convinced himself that she was going mad when she was showing zero signs of anything, and she was acting her normal self and being very calm and collected, occasionally being a little sad, generally being a human being. And then when she eventually can't take it anymore because he is being so cold and distant and treating her terribly and dehumanizing her and not using her name and avoiding her and ignoring her, she eventually has a bit of a breakdown and is so upset. And he uses that as proof that she is mad. And then when she's exhausted eventually and sort of accepts her fate and is numb and has closed herself off from him and is acting cold and distant, that's yet another example, apparently, that she's mad. And it just gets to the point where no matter what she does, she's just reinforcing his preconceived notions, like I was just talking about, that she is a mad woman. And I think the part that pissed me off the absolute most was the little passage where he basically claims that if she were only to get really emotional and beg him to love her and to prove that she loves just him and no one else, and that the tears are just for him, that he would love her forever, his little mad woman, and, forgive her everything. And, if she could only do that for him. And it's like, she literally just did that. She was just sobbing, begging you to love her and asking what she did wrong and doing everything she could to convince you that she loves you and wants you to love her and wants things to go back to how they were. And you just told her that you didn't love her and were completely cold and unfeeling and took that as evidence that she had lied to you and was this manipulative, mentally ill harpy or something. Just, oh my gosh, it boiled my blood. It's just the constant moving of the goalposts. And no matter what she does, he has now decided she's mad. And because she is literally mad, as in she's angry, she has released her anger. She is so upset with him and so righteously angry and rightfully so angry at this man. He decides that he hates her and he thinks that she is so hateful and evil and terrible. And, he becomes angry and jealous and feels, how dare he be chained to this insane woman forever? What did he do wrong? And she can hate him, but he can prove that he hates her more, and just, And the thing that gets me the most, again, obviously this is not written by the original author, so not necessarily the original intended backstory for these characters, but it fits so well with how Mr. Rochester is portrayed in Jane Eyre, which again just adds to more layers to what I was saying earlier, that I feel like if you already interpreted Mr. Rochester this way, which I think it's very easy to do based on the information we get in Jane Eyre, and a lot of people, I don't know if it's the majority, but a good number of people seem to interpret Mr. Rochester in that way. When you read this, it just makes so much sense for his character, that this is who he was back then. He just continues to let it fester. But for people who read Jane Eyre and saw Mr. Rochester as this misunderstood, passionate, romantic dreamboat, apparently people do. I don't know. I'm trying not to judge that, but questionable taste in men. Red flags abound. But anyways, for those people, reading this is going to very much push against their preconceived notions of Mr. Rochester, and they're not going to like it. And again, it's a theme in this story, this idea of deciding someone is something and then twisting reality to fit that definition, no matter what, rather than putting in the effort, sort of accepting the knock to your pride to accept you may have been wrong and shifting your perspective. You mold the world to your perspective rather than the other way around. I feel like some readers are doing that too. So many layers. Yeah, just absolutely maddening. I already disliked Mr. Rochester reading Jane Eyre, and I dislike him even more now, having read Wide Sargasso Sea. I continue to love Bertha, as she's called in Jane Eyre, but I will now think of her only as Antoinette, especially with that added headcanon or Jean Rhys canon of Bertha not actually being anything to do with her and just being a pet name that Mr. Rochester chose for her, as if she were a literal pet and not a human being, again, adding to the layers of dehumanization. And poor Antoinette, watching her just lose herself. Again, all those pressures and all the hatred and all of the expectation and the abandonment and the disconnection of her with her homeland and her support system, and locking her in a room for a decade with someone who believes her to be insane, and that's her only connection. And how else would she turn out? How else would any of us turn out? The reworking or the writing of that sort of final scene, the final night of her life, from her perspective was just absolutely heartbreaking. Kind of like this entire book. I feel like oppressive and heartbreaking are maybe the two best ways to describe this book as a whole, but so worth the read. So worth the read. If you've read Jane Eyre, please read Wide Sargasso Sea if you haven't already. Even if you somehow are a fan of Mr. Rochester, read it anyway, just for another perspective. And then let me know in the comments how you felt about it because I'm curious. But especially if you read Jane Eyre and, like me, had a visceral negative reaction to Mr. Rochester, I feel like you should read this. And especially if you read Jane Eyre and were intrigued by the idea of Bertha and didn't like the way that she was used for the plot and called a bunch of terrible names and dehumanized and treated terribly by the characters and then just thrown away like she was irrelevant and not addressed again until again she popped up conveniently later in the plot to do more damage, because this story really gives her her own story and gives the character her voice back in, again, a way that I found very beautiful. So, do I have more thoughts? I don't know. It is so late. It's almost 3 a.m. now. I feel like I am incoherently babbling about how much I loved this book. Although, is that any different from what I normally do? I don't know. You tell me. I just loved Antoinette. I loved this entire story, and I loved that we got more of her. I thought Christophine was fantastic. She was such a vivid character, and her relationship with Antoinette was so complex and very, very layered, and they had so much history, and it really felt like they had so much history in all of their dialogue, all their interactions, which I thought was so fascinating and beautiful. And Mr. Rochester, what an ass. An ass even when he was a young man. And I loved Christophine calling him out at one point of just how hard and cold and distant he was. Oh, I literally just opened the page without trying. That was some sort of magic. You are a damn hard man for a young man. Yeah. And then calls him out even more, saying, I know that girl. She will never ask you for love again. She will die first. But I, Christophine, I beg you. She love you so much. She thirsty for you. Wait, and perhaps you can love her again. A little, like she say. A little, like you can love. Like, damn. Just calling him out. Like, I know you can only love a little. I know you only have a tiny little shriveled up heart that can only love this much. But give her that much. She deserves it. She loves you so much. And she deserves that tiny little infinitesimal smidge of love that you are capable of giving. Give it to her, goddammit. And he's like, no, actually, in fact, I will choose to hate her instead. Thank you so much for your great advice. Because he's the worst. Okay, do I have more thoughts? More coherent thoughts? I don't think so. Again, almost 3 a.m, but I thought this was amazing. This was so good. Okay, spoilers are done. I loved this so much. This is a 5-star read. This is a new favorite. This was so good. It definitely can't do what it does without Jane Eyre. It is built on the foundation of Jane Eyre. I mean, I would be curious to hear the impressions and thoughts from people who have read this who didn't read Jane Eyre first, because that would be also a very interesting experience. But it is so much richer, I think, because of what Charlotte Bronte built with Jane Eyre. But I personally much preferred this as a book over Jane Eyre, and just generally was a lot more invested and just thought the execution was top notch here. So 3 stars for Jane Eyre, 5 stars for Wide Sargasso Sea, 5 stars for the experience in general of reading these as a little pair. I think it is a fantastic way to read Jane Eyre as a classic and then to immediately get a little lecture and have some more critical thought about the story and the perspective in Jane Eyre, and give us a chance to sort of question the narrative we're being fed by these characters. So good. So good. I'm so glad that I did this. I'm very glad I waited to read Jane Eyre until I had a copy of Wide Sargasso Sea so I could read them back to back, because that was just an awesome experience. I think I'm riding a book high right now. Or maybe I'm just tired. Little of column A, little of column B, but I had so much fun. Thank you for coming with me on this literary adventure. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments, if you haven't already, your thoughts on these books. If you've read Jane Eyre and or Wide Sargasso Sea, what's your rating? What are your thoughts? How do you feel about the two of them as companion novels, or Wide Sargasso Sea as a critique of Jane Eyre? But I need to go to bed, so I'm going to say goodnight and goodbye. Thank you to my patrons for your support, as always. Thank you to Bluehost for sponsoring this video. Click the link in my description box to check them out. And thank you for hanging out with me for this video. I appreciate you all so much, and I will see you very soon in my next one. Bye, friends. My face hurts from smiling. Oh my god. See, look. Can you see that? 3 a.m. The things I do for you. Okay, I mostly did it for myself. I really wanted to finish it before I went to bed. Okay. I'm just gonna keep drinking my sleepy time tea out of my Christmas mug. Cat mom Christmas mug. And then I'm gonna go to sleep. Okay. My face really does hurt.